Ceann Comhairle. Obviously, Minister, the circumstances of this bill arise from the retirement of Chief of Staff Conor Boyle and the Government's decision to promote Mark Mellett as the new Chief of Staff. Because currently he wouldn't be under existing legislation of sufficiently high rank. I note in the explanatory memorandum that you've spelt his name wrong, so I hope that doesn't jeopardise the plans and we'll be back to the drawing board again. But nonetheless, I think the idea of changing the law in response to an appointment is generally not a good practice. I'm not in any way casting aspersions on the individual in question, but it's a little bit like if in this same week we have the appointment of Justice Mary Ellen Ring as the new GSOC Commissioner, and again she has to be moved up the rank in order to take that position. If we're saying that these positions should be open to all, then they should be open to all, and we should change the circumstances that allow that to happen rather than a piecemeal scenario. So I think that is a better practice. I think it is important that this discussion is taking place against the backdrop of the overall changes to the Defence Forces, the discussions around the White Paper and all the rest of it. And I think in that context it would be an awful shame to forfeit the opportunity to maybe make some broader points in relation to that. I have no knowledge of Rear Admiral Mellett whatsoever. I believe he is highly regarded by the staff and the Defence Forces personnel across the board, although based on some of the things that I've heard I'd be a little bit wary. He reminds me of my time in Aer Lingus when Christoph Muller was appointed as Chief Executive. A lot of the staff very much welcomed his different approach. They welcomed the fact that maybe he was perceived as somebody who could come in with a new broom and rustle the feathers of those in the privileged positions of management. But of course, when he was finished doing that, having got the assistance of the staff in many instances, of course, he moved against them then as well. So I would maybe sound that word of warning. The Rear Admiral seems to be very talented. He's moved very quickly through the ranks. I believe he was appointed into the special post of Rear Admiral by former Minister Shatter a number of years ago. An appointment that took place at the time when there was a moratorium on general recruitment in the civil service, which was a little bit unusual, and now he's been promoted again in order to take over as Chief of Staff. Maybe that's the best decision, maybe it isn't, I don't know. But there is a contrast, in my opinion, between the way in which this has been dealt with and maybe the way in which the ordinary ranks of the Defence Forces are being dealt with, and we have to take that into account. I mean, I do want to acknowledge again the difficulties that have been highlighted by organisations like PD Fora about the struggle in the living standards of Defence Forces personnel because of repeated years of pay cuts, the fact that large percentages of our soldiers have to rely on FIS to make ends meet. We've had the dreadful treatment of the families of some former Defence Forces personnel in being evicted out of their dwellings in areas like the Curragh Camp and so on. And we've had stories, confirmed stories, because of the closure of barracks, of soldiers having to sleep in cars because they haven't got the income to pay on lengthy transport journeys to go to their new bases and so on. And that isn't good common sense as far as I'm concerned. And when we're talking about facilitating a promotion here, then we have to look at the avenue that ordinary personnel have to promotion as well. And I'd like us to discuss that, because it is the case inside the Army presently that officers are filling vacancies that were previously filled by NCOs. That's happening, and it's cutting across the opportunities of soldiers. For example, a dining hall has an officer in charge, whereas previously it had a sergeant in charge, and so on. I think it is the case that enlisted personnel find that it's difficult to fulfil their contracts and get their service periods abroad, because some functions that were traditionally the functions of soldiers are being given to officers, and greater numbers of officers are making those trips overseas, playing the role and carrying out functions such as being drivers and so on. And that's closing off a promotional route to our ordinary NCOs. And I think when we're talking here about promotion, let's look at some of those things as well, because I think they are linked. I believe that Rear Admiral Mellett is on record as saying that he has a belief and he's favourable to the idea of commissioning from the ranks and challenging some of that Chinese wall that exists between the ranks and the officer classes, for want of a better word, and I would welcome that approach. Yeah, and he supports that, and I've said I welcome that approach. I think it's a necessary way to go. But I do think we have to listen a lot more, because the feeling is that there's a pretty low morale existing inside our defence forces. The 3-brigade structure hasn't worked. There's a belief that it was totally dysfunctional, really, and misguided. We have, troops from Finner Camp coming up to do duties in Dublin. We even have staff, military police, being sent up from Athlone to do duties here in Leinster House. It doesn't really make any sense in that regard, and I think we have to take cognizance of that, because, while we're facilitating a promotion here, let's look at the promotions through the ranks. I think an important challenge for the new Chief of Staff will be to listen more to the personnel on the ground. And I would say that the role of the Defence Forces Ombudsman, for example, there's been a little bit of contention around that role, because previous Chiefs of Staff have sometimes ignored the recommendations and rulings of the Ombudsman. There's also belief maybe that the Ombudsman couldn't fulfil his function properly enough because the position is held by a former military judge, and that it's somewhat of a part-time position. So I would hope that the new Chief of Staff, in assuming his duties, won't go down that road and will in fact pay heed to the recommendations and rulings of the Defence Forces Ombudsman. I think it is appropriate, seeing as we are talking about the appointment of the first naval officer as Chief of Staff of the Defence Forces, that we do look at the role of the naval services itself. And I think it is, as Deputy Tobin did, let's look at the role of the Ellie Etna. Now, I very much welcome any genuine participation by Irish Defence Forces personnel, or anybody else for that matter, in intervening in the horrendous migrant crisis in the Mediterranean. But since we last discussed this at Defence Questions a number of weeks ago, when we raised the fact that Frontex, the border security organisation, which was in an exercise of not humanitarian search and rescue, but really border management, a claim which the Minister studiously denied and said, no, we were purely motivated by humanitarian concerns in our efforts. Of course, subsequent to our last discussion on that a number of weeks ago, documents came to light through the This Week programme on RTE, which revealed very clearly that your government actually opposed search and rescue operations. And in fact, when we were tabling here and discussing as important topical issues the ending of the Mare Nostrum Italian search and rescue operation and the devastating impact that that was going to have at the time, little did we know, as we know now, that Irish government ministers were going to European meetings and were ordered to stay stum and to say absolutely nothing, make no contribution at all, the document said. And if you have to say something, well, talk about the 300 people who are here already. Now, that's not good enough, and that to me was misleading the House about our role there, when what we have said is the Ellie Etna and the Ellie Niamh now should be, when they rescue migrants in those precarious waters, that they should see those ships as Irish property and facilitate those people with entry into Ireland. But the reality is that this government and the documents there supported the ending of Mare Nostrum, which led to the deaths of thousands of people, and I don't think that that's good enough. I welcome the fact that the Navy are there now, but I would wish that they were there in a much more comprehensive way, which would deal with refugees and the migrant crisis. I suppose the last point to make really is to pick up on the point made by Deputy Tobin about neutrality and the backdrop of the operation of our defence forces. In that sense, I would be a little bit concerned, maybe, that amongst the pedigree of Rear Admiral Mellett, he bears the distinguished graduate from the US Naval War College in Rhode Island as one of his points on his CV or whatever. And I am deeply concerned at the close relationship between the US military and the Irish Defence Forces in the context of the sincerely held belief of most citizens that we should be neutral. That cooperation is shown by the daily contact between the US Defence Attaché located in Ireland and the Irish Defence Forces, and of course it's particularly shown by our facilitation of the US war machine through the repeated use of Shannon Airport, which on a daily basis sees 2 US military aircraft landing, not to mind the thousands of troops, in total 2.5 million troops that have crossed this country on the way to devastation in the Middle East. And undoubtedly that is a contributing factor to the destabilisation that has taken place around the globe and the development of ISIS. And I think if the new Defence Forces and the new Chief of Staff is going to operate, then it should be operating against a backdrop of much more enhanced and active neutrality, which unfortunately under this government has seemed to creep in the opposite direction. But I think these will be debates that we'll have around the new White Paper. I wish the new Chief of Staff all the best. I wish the retiring Chief of Staff a happy retirement, and I would hope that the standards set and the facilitating of individuals shown to those at the top of the Defence Forces will also be exercised by those in the middle and ordinary ranks, and the men and women who do enormous service both in Ireland and internationally as part of our peacekeeping operations. There's no point in patting those people on the back, telling them they do a great job, which they do, and then refusing to remunerate them appropriately and allow them to live with their families with a decent standard of living.